The night in Tokyo did not feel like victory. It felt unfinished. Deep beneath the city, men who had planned this war for years stood in silence, waiting for proof that history had moved in their favor. The attack had succeeded. Ships burned, aircraft lay broken. An empire had struck first and struck hard, yet no one celebrated. They were waiting for America to react. Japanese strategy had never feared American weapons. It feared American. Delay, debate, confusion, political paralysis. Time was the foundation of the plan. Time to secure territory, time to fortify, time to force negotiation. Then the response arrived, and it was not what anyone expected. There was no hesitation, no division, no pause. America did not argue. It moved. Radios carried one clear message into millions of homes. Factories stayed lit through the night. Workers did not wait for orders. Assembly lines prepared for a new purpose. Offices reopened. Files moved faster than policy ever had before. What shifted was not visible on maps or reports. It was something deeper, an entire society changing direction. At once, Japanese planners had studied America for years, but they had studied a peaceful nation. They had never studied a unified one. Democracy, they believed, was slow. Because it was weak, they failed to see that it was slow. Because it chose restraint, and when that restraint vanished, momentum replaced doubt. The war had begun exactly as planned, but already it was no longer unfolding as expected. The greatest damage inflicted that day was not a steel or concrete. It was a hesitation itself. Japan had not bought time and had given America purpose. Japan had entered the war carrying a belief that felt unshakable, that democracy was fragile, that freedom produced hesitation, and that comfort bred weakness. This belief had not formed overnight. It had been reinforced through years of reports, filtered conversations, and assumptions repeated until they sounded like fact. American protests were studied. Isolationist speeches were archived, and every sign of political disagreement was treated as proof that the nation would fracture under pressure. Planners convinced themselves that a society built on choice could not sustain sacrifice, that voters would turn against war once costs appeared, and that leaders would argue instead of act. This illusion became the foundation of strategy. It shaped timelines, objectives, and confidence. Japan did not plan to defeat America outright. It planned to confuse, delay, and exhaust it long enough to force compromise. This was not arrogance alone. It was comfort. The comfort believing the enemy would behave exactly as expected. Dissent was mistaken for weakness. Debate was mistaken for paralysis. And peace was mistaken for softness. What Tokyo failed to understand was that disagreement in America was not decay. It was tension waiting for resolution. Once that resolution arrived, disagreement did not slow action. It sharpened it. When the attack came, all the arguments that once divided the nation collapsed into irrelevance. Protest movements vanished not because they were crushed, but because their purpose evaporated. The question of whether the fight no longer existed. Unity did not require force. It arrived naturally, and instantly. Japanese intelligence did not fail to gather information. It failed to listen to what it did not want to hear. Warnings about industrial strength were minimized. Reports about cultural resilience were dismissed, and voices that challenged consensus were sidelined as pessimistic or compromised. This was not a lack of data. It was a failure of imagination. The idea that democracy could transform faster than command structures did not fit the narrative. So it was ignored. Japan believed it was striking a slow opponent, when in reality, it was unlocking a restrained one. The illusion of weakness had been comforting. But comfort is dangerous in war because it discourages preparation for the unexpected. And when the illusion shattered, it did so without noise, without warning, and without mercy, leaving behind a realization that arrived too late. The enemy they thought they understood had never truly been studied. At all across the ocean, the shift became audible before it became visible. When the American president spoke, the country did not hear uncertainty. It heard finality. The words carried no invitation for debate, no appeal for patience, no opening for retreat. They sounded like a verdict already delivered. Families listening by radio felt it immediately. This was not a request for support. It was a declaration of direction. The speech did not wander. It moved with purpose, naming events, listing attacks, defining the moment with calm precision. There was no rage in the tone and no hesitation, only certainty, the kind that removes doubt rather than provoking fear. In living rooms and kitchen, silence followed, not because people were unsure, but because they understood something irreversible had begun. The nation did not wait for further explanation or clarification. It did not ask how long the war would last or what would cost. Those questions belonged to another time. The message was simple, and it landed everywhere at once. America was no longer choosing whether to act. It had chosen to commit. The power of the speech was not in its emotion, but in its restraint. It treated victory as inevitable and endurance as assumed. It framed the conflict not as a reaction, but as a responsibility. and that. Framing changed everything. Within hours, recruitment stations filled. Factories shifted priorities, and newspapers abandoned speculation for certainty. What Japan had expected to be chaos became coordination. The voice on the radio had not ignited panic. It had aligned purpose. And alignment moves faster than fear ever can. What followed shocked Japanese observers more than any military report, because it defied every model they trusted. Political rivals in America did not exploit the crisis. They erased themselves. Party lines dissolved. Speeches of opposition disappeared. Overnight, men who had argued for neutrality reversed course without hesitation, not under pressure, but voluntarily. Public figures who once warned against war now spoke only of unity. Debate did not slow the response, it ended it entirely. Because the question itself had been answered, there was no need to persuade the nation. It persuaded itself. Disagreement requires uncertainty, and uncertainty no longer existed. Communities organized without instruction. Cities moved in sync. Newspapers spoke with one voice, not through censorship, but through consensus. What Japan had mistaken for a permanent division was revealed to be conditional. Peace had allowed argument. War demanded alignment, and alignment came instantly. This was not unity enforced by fear. It was unity born of clarity, and clarity is far more powerful. Japan had prepared to face a fractured democracy. Instead, it faced a single will spread across millions of people, acting independently yet together. And that kind of unity cannot be disrupted. Because it does not rely on command, it relies on conviction. And conviction, once shared, becomes unstoppable. The true scale of the miscalculation revealed itself not in speeches or votes, but in factories across America, where transformation began without orders, without delay, and without hesitation. Production lines that had built civilian goods simply changed direction. Machines did not stop. They adapted. Light stayed on to the night shifts, multiplied not because the government demanded it, but because workers returned voluntarily. Industry did not wait to be mobilized, it mobilized itself. This was not emergency improvisation. It was activation. A system that already existed. Steel flowed faster, rubber was redirected, assembly lines shortened cycles, and output surged at speeds Japanese planners had declared impossible. America was not building a war machine from nothing. It was removing restraints from one that had been waiting. Corporations competed to contribute. Unions suspended. Conflict and efficiency replaced caution. The industrial base responded like a living organism, sensing threat and accelerating instinctively. This was a moment when strategy collapsed because numbers replaced theory, production replaced prediction, and math replaced hope. Japan had counted ships, aircraft, and territory, but had underestimated the engine behind them, an engine that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The war was no longer a contest of tactics. It was becoming a contest of capacity. And in that contest, momentum mattered more than bravery. And America had it in abundance. As America accelerated, the rest of the world quietly adjusted its posture. Without announcement or ceremony, powers that had been trapped between choices suddenly found clarity. Borders that once demanded vigilance relaxed. Alliances that once required caution simplified. The Soviet Union no longer feared pressure from two directions and shifted its focus westward. Germany welcomed distraction without offering support, and Britain gained breathing room without sacrifice. Japan expected the world to fragment. Instead, it aligned around a single consequence. The attack had not expanded Japan's influence. It had reduced uncertainty. For everyone else, each rival now knew where America stood and what it would do next. Strategic ambiguity vanished. Calculations shortened. Decisions hardened, and the global board reset itself in ways Tokyo had not anticipated. Japan stood committed across vast distances. While others consolidated strength closer to home, the war had not multiplied fronts, it had clarified them, and clarity favors those with depth, resources, and time qualities Japan lacked. But its enemy possessed an overwhelming measure inside Japan's leadership. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. Reports accumulated, projections were revised, and confidence gave way to calculation that felt colder and heavier than fear. Victories that once looked decisive began to resemble exposure. Every mile gained now required defense against an enemy growing stronger. By the week, the language in briefings changed. Optimism disappeared, replaced by arithmetic, and endurance became the unspoken concern. Conversations once filled with certainty now ended in silence. When the question of time arose, the recognition was unavoidable. Tactical success had not created safety, it had accelerated consequence. The war had not turned in America's favor because of a single battle, but because of momentum that could not be reversed. Acknowledgement of this truth was not dramatic. It was quiet, contained, and devastating leaders trained to project resolve confronted the limits of will against capacity. And in that confrontation, the future became painfully clear not because of defeat on the battlefield, but because the numbers no longer lied and there was no argument left to make against them. The final understanding did not arrive with surrender or collapse. It arrived with acceptance. The war had already been decided long before most battles would be fought not by courage or strategy, but by commitment measured in time, and output. The moment America unified, the outcome began moving in only one direction. Every ship sunk could be replaced, every loss absorbed, every setback corrected, because the engine driving the war never slowed. What Japan had hoped would be a brief, decisive conflict became a test of endurance. It could not pass the realization was not that defeat was imminent, but that it was inevitable. The attack meant to secure the future had instead defined a history, would remember the battles, the sacrifices, and the turning points, but beneath all of it lay a quieter truth. The war was not lost in fire or steel. It was lost in the moment hesitation vanished, and purpose took its place. When that happened, the outcome ceased to be a question and became a process unfolding over time. Japan had not awakened an enemy it could defeat. It had awakened one it could not outlast. In the years that followed, historians would search for the exact moment the tide turned. Many would point to battles, islands, or surrender ceremonies. But the truth lay earlier and quieter. The moment when assumptions collapsed and reality took their place. The moment when speed replaced hesitation and unity replaced doubt. That shift did not explode, it settled. And once settled, it could not be undone. Nations often lose wars not when they're defeated, but when they misunderstand who they are fighting. Japan believed it was confronting a divided society, hesitant and fragile. Instead, it confronted a peaceful society that, once provoked, became relentless. The lesson would echo far beyond this war. Power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, restrained, underestimated, and dismissed until a single moment removes the limits holding it back. When that happens, history no longer asks who will win, it only records how long it takes. Time itself became the enemy. Japan could no longer outrun. Every new report reinforced the same pattern. American strength was not peaking. It was accelerating. Training camps expanded supply routes, multiplied shipyards, lengthened schedules. Instead of shortening them, losses that would have crippled other nations barely slowed production. This was not enthusiasm burning out. It was structure locking into place, a system designed for duration. Japanese planners had hope fatigue would weaken resolve, but fatigue never arrived because effort was shared across an entire society. Burden distributed. Purpose reinforced. Endurance did not depend on victory. It depended on belief, and belief had settled deeply. The realization was unavoidable. This was not a wave that would crash and recede. It was a tide that would keep rising until resistance was submerged. Japan was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay an outcome that had already been set in motion. As months passed, the distance between expectation and reality became impossible. To ignore early hopes that opportunity or error might reverse momentum faded. American forces adapted faster than anticipated. Strategies evolved. Losses were studied, not hidden, and every setback produced improvement rather than hesitation. What Japan faced was not rigidity, but learning, a system capable of correcting itself in real time. Leadership changed. Tactics, industry adjusted output, and society absorbed sacrifice without fracture. This adaptability proved as dangerous as sheer volume, because it meant the enemy was not only strong, but responsive. War is survivable against power that remains static. It becomes unwinnable against power that grows smarter. With pressure, Japan found itself locked into a struggle where every effort strengthened the opposition, and every delay widened the gap. The future narrowed not through sudden collapse, but through steady compression until options disappeared, and only endurance remained, and endurance was no longer equal. In the end, there was no single moment of collapse, only the quiet confirmation that the path ahead led nowhere new. The war had consumed years, lives, cities, and certainty, but the outcome had been written far earlier. When restraint was mistaken for weakness and unity was underestimated, what remained was consequence, unfolding exactly as momentum dictates. Empires do not fall only from enemy blows, they fall from the weight of decisions made in confidence and revealed in time. Japan's choice had awakened capacity beyond calculation, and once awakened, it could not be negotiated with. Delayed or undone history would later measure this war in battles and borders, but its true turning point lived in the understanding that power multiplied by unity becomes irreversible, and once that realization settled, there was nothing left to plan, only to endure what had already been set in motion.